The lower Mississippi River Basin in the early decades of the 19th century was a landscape defined as much by water as by land. The river itself, wide, slow, and immensely powerful, had spent thousands of years depositing the alluvial soil that made this region one of the most agriculturally fertile territories on the North American continent. The land was flat in ways that unsettled those accustomed to the varied topography of the eastern seaboard, and in the summer months it held heat with a particular intensity, the air heavy with moisture drawn up from the surrounding wetlands and cypress groves that lined the river's numerous tributaries. It was a landscape of extraordinary natural abundance, and it had been understood as such long before European surveyors arrived to measure and record it. For centuries before any plantation house rose from this soil, the land along the lower Mississippi was home to indigenous nations whose relationship with the river and its floodplains was intimate, practical, and deeply organized. The Natchez people, among others, had developed sophisticated agricultural systems, permanent settlements, and complex political structures that made use of the same fertile ground that would later draw European settlers in such numbers. Their presence shaped the physical landscape in ways that persisted long after their communities were displaced, in the elevated mounds that dotted the basin, in the cleared paths through dense woodland, and in the agricultural knowledge of the land that early settlers, whether they acknowledged it or not, found already legible when they arrived. The dispossession of these nations was neither sudden nor clean. It unfolded across decades of treaty negotiation, military pressure, and the slow erosion of territorial sovereignty that characterized the broader pattern of American westward expansion during this period. By the early 19th century, the land had passed through successive layers of European and American legal claims. Edmund Hargreaves was not a man who built for the present. When he commissioned the manor house in 1819, 8 years after his father Thomas had first secured the land patent along the lower Mississippi Basin, he was making a statement that extended well beyond the practical requirements of a working plantation. He was 34 years old, recently married, and in possession of a cotton operation that had expanded steadily through the preceding decade into one of the more productive holdings in the surrounding parish. The wealth was real, and it was growing. But wealth alone, in the social culture of the antebellum South, was insufficient as a foundation for the kind of standing Edmund Hargreaves intended to establish. What was required, and what he understood with considerable clarity, was architecture. The Greek Revival style that Edmund chose for the main house was not an accidental selection. By the second decade of the 19th century, the Greek Revival had become the dominant architectural language of public ambition across the United States, appearing in courthouses, banks, and governmental buildings from the Atlantic seaboard to the newly settled territories of the Lower South. Its vocabulary, the columned portico, the symmetrical facade, the triangular pediment, carried associations of democratic order, civic permanence, and classical civilization that resonated deeply with a planter class that consciously modeled its self-image on the landhold. Chapter 3. The Making of a Dynasty. The decade that followed the completion of the manor house was, by every measurable standard, a period of sustained expansion for the Hargreaves family. Edmund Hargreaves moved through the 1820s with the methodical confidence of a man who had already accomplished the most visible portion of his ambitions and was now consolidating the structures that would make those ambitions permanent. The cotton economy of the lower Mississippi Basin was in a period of considerable growth during these years, driven by the insatiable demand of the textile mills of Britain and the American Northeast, and Edmund was positioned to benefit from that growth with a combination of productive land, available capital, and the kind of regional social connections that converted economic advantage into political influence. By the close of the decade, the Hargreaves holding had nearly doubled in acreage from its 1811 origins, absorbing adjacent parcels through purchase and, on at least 2 documented occasions, through the settlement of neighboring families' debts. The physical estate itself reflected this expansion in deliberate and visible ways. During the mid-1820s, Edmund commissioned the construction of a formal detached kitchen building to the rear of the main house, followed by an extended service wing that connected the domestic outbuildings to the principal structure through a covered passage of brick and timber. A formal garden was laid out to the south of the house during the same period, its geometric beds and gravel paths designed according to the conventions of American pleasure grounds of the era, ordered, symmetrical, and clearly distinguished from the working agricultural landscape that surrounded it on every other side. A private family cemetery was established on a small wooded rise to the northwest of the main house, enclosed by a low iron fence of local manufacture, its presence on the landscape a quiet but unmistakable declaration of the family's intention to remain rooted in this particular ground across generations. Edmund's political influence during the 1830s grew in proportion to the estate's economic productivity. He served on the parish police jury, the administrative body responsible for local governance in Louisiana's distinctive legal geography, and his correspondence from this period reflects a man whose opinions on matters of land use, taxation, and labor regulation were sought and respected by other planters and local officials. The plantation house itself became a site of social consolidation during these years, hosting gatherings of regional significance, meetings of agricultural societies, political discussions among the planter class, and the elaborate seasonal entertainments that marked the social calendar of wealthy Southern families. The formal parlor and dining room that Edmund had appointed with such care in the early 1820s were put to sustained use as instruments of hospitality and social positioning. The management of the estate had, by the 1830s, been formalized into a hierarchical structure of considerable complexity. Edmund employed a white overseer responsible for the supervision of field labor, but beneath that layer of management lay the far more intricate social world of the enslaved community whose labor under Chapter 4: The Enslaved World Within the Walls. The plantation records of the Hargraves estate survive in fragmentary but revealing form. Ledger pages, probate inventories, and the occasional overseer's report that together construct a partial portrait of the community whose labor made the manor house possible, and whose lives unfolded in the spaces that the estate's official history was never designed to preserve. These documents were not created to honor the people they recorded. They were administrative instruments of a system of total ownership, and they reflect that system's priorities with an unsettling precision. Yet within their columns of names, ages, and assigned monetary values, and within the oral traditions carried forward by the descendants of those recorded there, a more complete account of the estate begins to emerge. The spatial organization of the Hargraves estate encoded its social hierarchy. The 2 decades between 1835 and 1858 represent the fullest expression of everything Edmund Hargraves had set in motion when he first broke ground on the manor house in 1819. By the mid-1830s, the estate had reached a scale and social prominence that placed it among the most recognized private holdings in the surrounding parish, and the years that followed would see that prominence deepen rather than merely persist. The cotton economy of the lower Mississippi Basin remained productive through this period, and the Hargraves operation, by now encompassing several hundred acres of cultivated land, a substantial enslaved workforce, and a network of commercial relationships extending to factors in New Orleans, generated the kind of sustained revenue that allowed Edmund to turn his attention from consolidation toward embellishment. The physical expansion of the manor house during the late 1830s and into the 1840s was deliberate and architecturally coherent. A formal east wing was added to the main block of the house between 1838 and 1841, extending the principal facade and providing additional reception and sleeping rooms that the estate's growing social calendar required. The new wing was constructed in the same Greek Revival language as the original structure, its proportions carefully calibrated to maintain the symmetry of the whole. The prosperity that had defined the Hargraves estate through the 1840s did not collapse suddenly. It receded gradually in the manner of structural decline that is rarely visible in any single season, but becomes legible only in retrospect, when the accumulated evidence of many small decisions and deferred obligations is laid against the record of what the estate had once been. Cornelius Hargraves assumed effective management of the plantation's daily operations sometime in the early 1850s as Edmund's health declined and the older man's direct involvement in estate affairs diminished. The transition was natural in form but consequential in effect, because the qualities that had made Cornelius a socially successful representative of the family name were not the qualities that sustained a complex agricultural and financial operation through a period of increasing external pressure. The financial decisions Cornelius made during the 1850s are documented in surviving correspondence and in the records of the New Orleans commercial factors through whom the estate conducted its cotton transactions. They reveal a pattern of borrowing against future harvests, of investments in adjacent land made at prices that assumed continued cotton market strength, and of household expenditures on furnishings, entertainments, and the maintenance of a social position that the estate's actual revenues could no longer comfortably support, that incrementally deepened the family's exposure to creditors. The estate's formal appearance remained intact through this period. The house was maintained, the grounds kept, and the social calendar continued. But beneath that surface, the margin between the estate's income and its obligations was narrowing in ways that Cornelius either did not fully recognize or chose not to address directly. The disagreement between the family's two principal branches, Cornelius and his younger brother's line, which had settled on a separate parcel of the original Hargraves land grant, introduced a parallel layer of tension into the management of the family's shared interests. Probate and land records from the late 1850s document a dispute over the terms of Edmund's original will that was never fully resolved, leaving the boundaries of financial responsibility between the two branches ambiguous at precisely the moment when clarity would have mattered most. Within the quarters and the domestic spaces of the main house, the enslaved community observed these developments with the particular attentiveness of people whose own circumstances were bound to the estate's stability in ways entirely beyond their control, and whose accumulated knowledge of the family's private contradictions had been deepening for decades. The secession of Louisiana from the Union in January of 1861 transformed the political abstraction of sectional crisis into an immediate and material condition for every plantation household in the lower Mississippi basin. For the Hargraves family, as for their neighbors, the month that followed brought the particular disruption of men departing for military service, leaving behind estates whose operational complexity had always depended on the continuous presence of those who held legal authority over them. Cornelius Hargraves enlisted with a parish volunteer company in the spring of 1861, and surviving regimental records place him in Confederate service through the early campaigns of the war's Western theater. His younger male relatives followed in the subsequent months, and by the close of 1861, the Hargraves estate was being managed, in the most provisional sense of that word, by the women of the household and a reduced white overseer staff, whose authority over the enslaved workforce was already beginning to show the particular fragility that wartime conditions imposed on the plantation system's coercive foundations. The reorganization of labor on the estate during the war years is partially documented in a set of overseer reports that survive from 1862 and early 1863. They record a workforce that was present in diminishing numbers as enslaved men and women assessed their circumstances and acted on the opportunities that the war's disruption created. Some left in organized groups when Union gunboats moved through the river tributaries adjacent to the estate. Others departed individually, at night, following the network of knowledge about routes and distances that the enslaved community had maintained quietly for years. By the time Union forces established a sustained presence in the surrounding region in 1863, the Hargraves estate had lost a substantial portion of the workforce upon whose labor its entire economic logic had rested. The physical damage sustained by the main house during this period was partial but significant. Military records in a post-war insurance claim filed by the family document the commandeering of the manor house as a temporary Union officers' quarters during the latter stages of the conflict, an occupation that left the interior altered, furnishings removed or destroyed, several interior walls damaged, and the formal garden largely dismantled for the practical requirements of a military encampment. The east wing sustained structural damage to its roof during this period, the specific cause unrecorded but the effect documented in the post-war claim as requiring substantial repair. The private chapel survived the war years intact, its small scale and peripheral position on the grounds apparently rendering it beneath the notice of the practical calculations that governed wartime appropriation of private property. What the estate presented to the surviving Hargraves family upon their return in the months following Appomattox was a landscape altered in ways that no repair of plasterwork or replacement of furnishings could fully address. The economic system that had generated the estate's wealth was legally dissolved. The community of enslaved men, women, and children whose labor had sustained every dimension of the plantation's operation, the fields, the house, the outbuildings, the garden, had dispersed, many permanently and irreversibly. The cotton fields that Edmund Hargraves had cultivated so carefully across 4 decades lay worked only partially, the harvest of 1865 a fraction of what the estate had produced in its years of greatest productivity. The house still stood, its Greek Revival facade still symmetrical and composed above the river plain, but the social and economic world that had given that facade its meaning had been fundamentally and permanently reorganized. The immediate post-war condition of the Hargraves estate was, in this respect, neither exceptional nor unusual among the plantation houses of the lower Mississippi Basin. It shared with dozens of comparable properties the particular condition of a structure whose physical form had survived largely intact, while the system that produced and sustained it had been brought to a legal and practical end. The damage was real, to the roof of the east wing, to the interior appointments, to the formal grounds, but it was the kind of damage that money and labor could, in principle, address. The deeper alteration, the one that would prove consequential in the decades ahead, was not structural. It resided in the changed terms on which the estate would now have to operate, and in the substantially reduced resources with which the Hargraves family would be required to meet them. The legal framework of Reconstruction imposed upon the former Confederate states a set of conditions that transformed the economic foundations of plantation agriculture with a thoroughness that no amount of post-war optimism among the planter class could offset. For the Hargraves family, the years between 1865 and the early 1870s constituted a period of sustained legal and financial pressure that the estate's pre-war debts, already considerable before the conflict began, made particularly difficult to absorb. The labor system upon which the plantation's productivity had rested for more than 4 decades was legally dissolved, and the transition to sharecropping and tenant farming arrangements that many former planters negotiated with formerly enslaved workers offered a structural replacement that was economically inferior in almost every measurable respect to what it succeeded. Cornelius Hargraves returned from Confederate service in poor health and with the estate's financial situation materially worse than when he had departed. The wartime debt accumulated against anticipated cotton revenues that the conflict had prevented the estate from generating now matured into obligations that the reduced post-war operation could not service from current income. Land sales began in 1867, when a parcel of several hundred acres on the estate's eastern boundary, among the most productive of the original holding, was conveyed to a neighboring creditor in partial settlement of outstanding obligations. Additional parcels followed across the early 1870s, each transaction reducing the estate's productive capacity and, with it, the revenue available to service the debts that remained. The formal legal record of these transactions is precise and detailed, recording the progressive contraction of a landholding that Edmund Hargraves had spent 3 decades assembling. What the legal record does not fully capture is the sustained effort the family made throughout this period to maintain the social appearance of their former standing. The manor house continued to be occupied and nominally maintained through the 1870s and into the 1880s. The formal rooms were kept furnished, seasonal social engagements were observed where resources permitted, and the family's name continued to appear in the parish social record with a regularity that belied the actual condition of the estate's finances. This performance of continuity, the maintained facade, the observed ritual of gentry social life, was neither unique to the Hargraves family nor without its own particular logic. In a social world where reputation and credit were intimately connected, the appearance of stability carried practical value, even when the substance it was meant to represent had been substantially eroded. The third generation of the Hargreaves family came of age within this contracted and increasingly strained version of the estate. Cornelius's children, fewer in number than the preceding generation, a reflection of both the war's direct losses and the altered social circumstances of the post-war years, inherited a family identity constructed around a scale of landholding and social authority that no longer existed in material form. Their education was more limited than their fathers had been, their social connections narrower, and their practical relationship to the estate more immediately concerned with its day-to-day maintenance than with the expansive ambitions that had characterized the generation of their grandfather, Edmund. The institutional structures that had supported the Hargreaves family's position, the commercial factor networks of New Orleans, the parish political relationships, the social architecture of the planter class itself, had been reorganized or dissolved by the war and its aftermath, and the third generation navigated a regional landscape that offered fewer of the established pathways to recovery that their predecessors might have followed. By the close of the 1880s, the Hargreaves estate had been reduced to the main house, its immediately surrounding grounds, and a modest working acreage that bore little resemblance to the plantation operation Edmund Hargreaves had developed across the first half of the century. The house itself remained structurally sound in its principal sections, the east wing roof having been repaired at some point in the 1870s with materials and workmanship of notably lesser quality than the original construction. The formal garden had been reduced in its maintained extent, the more distant portions of the original design allowed to revert to grass and scrub. The private chapel still stood, its interior still occasionally used, though the regularity of its use had diminished with the family's reduced circumstances. The estate retained its form while shedding, year by year and acre by acre, the substance that had given that form its original meaning.
By the time the calendar turned to 1900, the Hargreaves Manor House had been standing for nearly 80 years, and the accumulation of that time was visible in every surface the building presented to the world. The principal facade remained structurally intact, its 6 columns still upright and its pediment still correctly proportioned above them, but the lime plaster that Edmund Hargreaves had applied with such care in the early 1820s had weathered through decades of Mississippi Basin humidity into a surface of irregular texture, cracked at the column capitals, stained with the dark vertical lines of water running from the roof gutters, and in several sections of the east wing entirely absent, exposing the brick beneath to the climate's continued attention. The family that occupied the house in these years consisted of a single household, a widow of the third generation, her adult son, and a reduced domestic staff of 2 or 3 individuals, whose resources were sufficient to maintain habitation but not restoration. The early 20th century documentary record of the estate is thin but suggestive. A small number of photographs survive from the first 2 decades of the century, their images rendered in the flat gray tones of the period's photographic technology, and they show a house in the condition that sustained occupation without adequate maintenance produces over time. The formal garden had by this point been reduced to a small kitchen garden immediately behind the main house, the geometric beds and gravel paths of Edmund's original design entirely absorbed into the encroaching grass of the surrounding grounds. The detached kitchen building, still in use, had lost a section of its roof at the rear and been partially repaired with corrugated metal sheeting whose surface caught the light differently from the original cypress shingles beside it. The private chapel, no longer in regular use by the early 1900s, had been closed and its door secured, its interior accumulating the particular stillness of a space that has outlasted the community it was built to serve. It was during this same period that the estate began to acquire, in the memory of the surrounding community, a character that its architectural decline and its increasing isolation made almost inevitable. The stories that attached themselves to the Hargreaves house in the early 20th century followed patterns that were neither unique to this property nor unfamiliar to students of Southern regional folklore. Accounts of unaccountable sounds within the empty rooms, of figures seen at windows that the surviving family members could not explain, of a particular quality of unease that visitors to the property reported with enough consistency to suggest something more than individual imagination. These accounts were documented in local newspaper columns of the period, collected by amateur historians of the region, and preserved in the oral traditions of the surrounding community with the particular tenacity that attaches to stories about places whose official histories feel incomplete. The relationship between the house's haunted reputation and the actual history it contained was not coincidental. The Hargraves estate had been the site of generations of human suffering, the daily violence, visible and invisible, of the plantation system, and the community that had accumulated knowledge of that history across the preceding century was the same community whose oral traditions now circulated accounts of the house's unsettled atmosphere. What the official record of the estate had never adequately acknowledged, the local memory preserved in a different register, translating the historical weight of the place into a language of supernatural unease that the period's cultural conventions made more expressible than the direct historical account would have been. This process of mythologization was not unique to the Hargraves property. Across the American South in the early 20th century, the plantation house had become a cultural object of considerable ideological weight, its physical form recruited into a narrative of lost elegance and aristocratic decline that systematically displaced the histories of those whose labor had built it and whose suffering had filled its rooms. The legends that gathered around the Hargraves Manor participated in this broader cultural pattern while simultaneously, and perhaps unknowingly, preserving within their imagery something of the actual history that the romanticized narrative was designed to obscure. The house stood at the center of both stories simultaneously, its deteriorating walls holding within them a past that neither the family's reduced circumstances nor the community's evolving mythology had yet found adequate language to fully address. Chapter 10: The Stories That Took Hold. By the middle decades of the 20th century, the Hargraves Manor House had ceased to function primarily as a residence in the minds of the surrounding community and had become instead something closer to a landscape of accumulated memory, a physical structure whose deteriorating form served as a container for stories that the region's official historical record had never been equipped to hold. The accounts that circulated through the parishes adjacent to the estate during the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s were collected in part by folklorists working under the auspices of federal documentation projects during the Depression era, and their transcribed testimonies constitute one of the more revealing archival records associated with the property. What those transcriptions preserve is not a single coherent haunting narrative, but a constellation of independent accounts whose recurring elements suggest a community memory organized around specific historical experiences rather than generalized supernatural convention. The figures who appear most consistently across these testimonies are not the Hargraves family members themselves. They are unnamed individuals associated with the labor and domestic life of the plantation period, a figure described in multiple independent accounts as moving along the path between the quarters site and the main house at hours when no living person was present, and a presence reported specifically within the domestic spaces of the manor's rear service areas, where the work of maintaining the house had been performed across generations by people whose names the estate's formal records had reduced to inventory entries. The geography of the reported disturbances corresponded closely to the actual spatial organization of the working plantation, the paths, the service spaces, the outbuildings, rather than to the formal rooms whose architectural grandeur had become the focus of the romanticized plantation narrative circulating in the broader culture simultaneously. Treated as historical documents rather than supernatural testimony, these accounts reveal a community in the process of preserving, through the available cultural language of haunting and unease, a history that more direct forms of remembrance had not yet found adequate public space to express. The manor's reputation was, in this reading, a form of collective memory, imprecise in its details, but accurate in its weight. Eleanor Hargraves, recorded in county documents as Eleanor Marie Hargraves, great-granddaughter of Edmund, the estate's founder, was by every available account a woman who had been shaped entirely by the house she inhabited, and who, in the final decades of her life, became nearly inseparable from it in the perception of the surrounding community.
Born in 1891 to the last functioning branch of the Hargreaves family line, she had grown up in the manor house during its period of most visible decline, her childhood coinciding with the years in which the formal garden was absorbed into encroaching grass and the east wing roof received its inadequate repair. She never married. The county records that document her adult life are sparse: property tax filings, an occasional notation in the parish legal record, a deed of minor land transfer in the early 1930s, and they describe a woman whose relationship to the world beyond the estate's boundaries had contracted, year by year, into something approaching complete withdrawal. The condition of the house during her final decades of occupancy is partially reconstructed through 2 recorded interviews conducted with individuals who had occasion to visit the property during the 1950s, preserved in a Regional Historical Society archive. Their accounts describe a structure in which habitation had retreated to a small number of rooms on the ground floor of the main block, the formal rooms of the upper story long since closed and unheated, the east wing entirely sealed, the service areas reduced to the minimum necessary to support a single occupant of limited means. The furniture that remained was original to earlier generations of the family, its surfaces worn and in some cases structurally compromised, the rooms around it carrying the particular atmosphere of spaces that have been inhabited with great continuity, but without the resources or energy that maintenance requires. Eleanor Hargreaves died in 1963, the last direct descendant of the family line that Thomas Hargreaves had established on this ground in 1811. She left no heirs. The estate passed into a legal condition of unresolved ownership, its title disputed, its physical condition by that point advanced in deterioration, and its future entirely open in ways that the house's long history of deliberate dynastic intention had never anticipated or prepared for.
The legal disposition of the Hargreaves estate following Eleanor's death in 1963 occupied the parish court system for the better part of a decade. Without a direct heir and with the title encumbered by the accumulated complications of a century of partial land sales, disputed boundaries, and unresolved creditor claims, the property entered a condition of administrative suspension that effectively prevented any organized intervention in its physical deterioration during what proved to be a critical period for the structure's long-term survivability. The late 1960s and early 1970s were, across the American South, a moment of significant loss for the antebellum built environment, a period in which properties without clear ownership and active stewardship deteriorated with a speed that the preceding decades of minimal habitation had not prepared observers to anticipate. The Hargreaves Manor was among them. The building's condition during this period advanced from the deterioration of Eleanor's final occupancy into something more structurally consequential. The east wing, whose roof had been inadequately repaired in the 1870s and never properly addressed in the intervening century, sustained a partial collapse of its rear section sometime in the early 1970s, an event recorded in a preservation survey conducted by a State Historic Resources Office in 1974. That survey, one of the earliest formal architectural assessments of the property, documented the main block as structurally sound in its primary load-bearing elements, but compromised in its secondary systems, roof, window frames, interior plaster, to a degree that placed it at meaningful risk without intervention within a defined number of years. The survey's recommendations went unimplemented, their execution dependent on a resolution of the ownership question that the legal process had not yet produced. It was during this same period that a parallel and ultimately more durable form of advocacy for the site began to develop, initiated not by preservation institutions but by members of the surrounding community, specifically by descendants of the men and women who had been enslaved on the Hargreaves estate and whose family histories were inseparable from the property's own. Their efforts, documented in community organization records and local newspaper accounts from the late 1970s onward, sought something that the architectural preservation framework alone was not designed to provide: a formal acknowledgement that the full history of the site encompassed not only the Greek Revival facade and the family that commissioned it, but the lives of those whose labor had built every element of the structure and whose descendants remained present in the surrounding community.
This advocacy produced, by the early 1990s, a series of documented oral history collections, a community-organized historical marker, and the formal inclusion of the site in a regional heritage study that treated the plantation landscape as a complete historical environment rather than an architectural object in isolation. The house itself, by the time these acknowledgments were recorded, had entered the early 21st century in a condition of stabilized but unrestored deterioration, standing, documented, and finally, if incompletely, understood.
The Hargraves Manor House stands today as it has stood for the better part of 2 centuries, above the flat river plain of the lower Mississippi Basin, its columns still upright, its pediment still legible against whatever sky the season provides. The lime plaster that Edmund Hargraves applied in the early 1820s has largely yielded to the climate's persistence, and the brick beneath has darkened with the accumulated exposure of many decades, but the essential architectural argument that the building was designed to make remains structurally present. It is a house that was built to last, and in the most literal sense, it has. What has proven more complicated and more consequential is the question of what lasting means for a structure whose permanence was purchased at the cost that this one was. Plantation houses occupy a particular and contested position in the landscape of American historical memory. Their architectural quality is frequently genuine, the proportional intelligence of the Greek revival, the material craft of the construction, the spatial ambition of the interiors, and that quality has historically been the primary frame through which such buildings have been understood, preserved, and presented to the public. The history embedded in the same walls, the system of total human bondage that generated the wealth to build them, and the forced labor that constructed and maintained every element of their fabric, has occupied a secondary and frequently suppressed position in that framework. The effort to hold both histories simultaneously, to acknowledge the architectural achievement without allowing it to displace the human cost that made it possible, represents one of the more demanding interpretive challenges that the American historic preservation movement has confronted in its recent decades, and the Hargraves estate has been a modest but genuine participant in that broader reckoning. What the complete story of this house requires is not the diminishment of either account, but the sustained willingness to hold them in the same frame. The columns and the quarters, the marble mantelpieces and the inventory ledgers, the family name carved in the parish record, and the names reduced to columns of figures in the plantation account books. A house is always more than its architecture, and a history is always more than its most visible evidence. The Hargraves Manor endures as a structure, and what it asks of those who document it is the same quality its builders brought to its construction: patience, precision, and a clear-eyed willingness to account for everything the ground beneath it holds.